Hi, everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to get started in just a minute. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to be here celebrating the life and legacy of Representative Patsy Mink. My name is Jennifer Herrera. I am the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum, and I am just absolutely thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to be consultants to the U.S. Mint on this program. So I'm going to be your MC for the event today. And to kick things off, I'd like to welcome the President and CEO of the National Women's History Museum, Frédérique Irwin.
Thank you, Jen. Let me move this up. Good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with you today on behalf of the National Women's History Museum. We are such proud co-hosts of this event alongside our incredible partners, the U.S. Mint, Senator Hirono, and her wonderful team, the Smithsonian Asia Pacific American Center, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. The National Women's History Museum began nearly 3 decades ago when our founder, Karen Stacer, arrived in Washington, D.C., in a city filled with monuments and memorials and museums, and noticed that women were largely absent. Nearly 30 years later, the National Women's History Museum is both an innovative, virtual-first museum dedicated to amplifying women's diverse contributions to society and the nation's leading cultural institution for women's history. Our most recent physical exhibition, called We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC, is on display through September right down the street at the MLK Library. Through digital and physical experiences, educational resources, events, programs, and partnerships, our institution works every day to ensure that women's history is accessible and available to all. Women's history is history, and we know that if you can see it, you can be it. Today, we dream of a world where women's impact and contributions, past and present, ignite tangible action in today's generation for gender equality and empowerment. And it is this very urgent pursuit of action towards gender equality that brings us here today to recognize a true trailblazer and inspiration whose contributions have left an indelible mark on our nation's history. Today, we are here to celebrate the Honorable Patsy Mink, the first woman of color elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first Asian American woman to serve in Congress, and the first Asian American woman to run for president. Among her many accomplishments in Congress, Mink was the champion behind seminal legislation that has profoundly shaped our country and helped make our nation more equitable and inclusive. Title IX, the Early Childhood Education Act, and the Women's Educational Equity Act, just to name a few. Today, nearly 52 years since the enactment of Title IX, Representative Mink is featured on a U.S. circulating quarter. As Jennifer shared, as a consultant to the U.S. Mint on the American Women's Quarters program, we are so incredibly proud to have been part of the team who recommended Representative Mink for this tremendous and greatly deserved honor. We have a wonderful program in store for all of you today. You'll hear from many distinguished guests, view the short documentary called Mink, and learn more about Representative Mink's life, work, and contributions from our incredible panel. Thank you to everyone here, all of our partners, our panelists, and to Gwendolyn Mink. May Representative Mink's legacy be a call to action that we all heed, to take meaningful action to create a more equal, just, and inclusive world. It is now my honor to introduce you to some of today's distinguished guests. Up next, you will hear from Senator Mazie Hirono, Representative Judy Hsu, Representative Ed Case, and Representative Jill Takuda. Please help me welcome our co-host for today's event, Senator Hirono.
Aloha, everybody. I am delighted to be here with all of you and to see these images of Patsy Mink. It really warms my heart. And Wendy, it's great to see you, as always. So we are here to mark the launch of the Patsy Mink Quarter. And I want to, again, give my special thanks to the organizations and people who were involved in making this happen. Of course, the U.S. Mint, the National Women's History Museum, the American Women's History Museum, the Asia Pacific American Center, and of course, Dr. Wendy Mink for helping to make all of this possible. Today we gather in the Pelosi Caucus Room. They renamed this room for Nancy Pelosi, and it warms the cockles of my heart to have that happen. Because as you say, as we just heard, there just aren't enough recognition of the women who have been leaders in our country, and certainly Nancy Pelosi deserves to have this room named for her, so I'm glad for that. We're gathered once again in this renamed caucus room to honor Patsy Mink's legacy, including her work to advance gender equity in education through Title IX, the landmark civil rights law she authored in Congress. I think some of us know this, and you are going to see a video or a documentary of Patsy, and it's my favorite documentary. I call it the Yellow Car documentary. You're in for a treat. This is my favorite documentary of Patsy. But I think we all know that one of the reasons that Patsy was such a fighter for equality and gender equity in particular was her own life experience in trying to get into medical school. She applied to 14 medical schools, and they all turned her down because she was a woman. Then, undaunted, she decided to become a lawyer and applied to law school. So perseverance is one of her hallmarks. The law school she attended was the University of Chicago Law School, and one of the interesting things about that was that the law school put her in the international dorm because they didn't know that she was an American citizen, I guess. So we have these issues, and then the story of a generation later, and her daughter Wendy Mink trying to get into Stanford and being told they had enough women. I think that is the story about Wendy. So it certainly impelled Patsy to pursue Title IX, which is only 37 words long. Title IX has empowered generations of women and girls in our country by banning gender discrimination in education. Title IX's impact is hard to overstate. Just a few weeks ago, a record number, 18.7 million people watched the NCAA Women's Basketball National Championship game between Iowa and South Carolina. Nearly 4 million more people watched the women's basketball game than watched the men's basketball national championship game. I say about time. My husband watched that game. In fact, he's a total basketball fiend, and he loves to watch women's basketball because he says that they show a lot more finesse and, frankly, talent than the men's. So coming from him, that's a lot. So without Title IX, of course, that never would have happened. Without Patsy, it never would have happened. But as I often say, the fights we thought we had won never stay won. So whether it's voting rights or women's right to choose and other rights that we have, we have to be eternally vigilant. And today, some of the right are attempting to co-opt Title IX to dismantle or to discriminate or dismantle the protections for LGBTQ plus students. As someone who knew Patsy, as so many of us did, and her right for equal treatment for all, she would have thought discriminating against the LGBTQ community, using Title IX, by the way, for that proposition, it would be totally anathema to her. The last time I saw Patsy, we were both in the Kailua 4th of July parade. She invited me to have lunch with her. And what she said to me was, before she passed in 2002, it was the last time I saw her, she told me to keep going and to never stop fighting. Perseverance is what she would expect from all of us. I hope this quarter will serve as a similar reminder and motivator to women and girls and men in our country, because equal rights should be a matter of support from all of us, but that this quarter will be a reminder that the fight continues. And when we all see Patsy's smiling face on the quarter and depicted with Title IX, again, I hope it reminds us to keep on fighting. Perseverance is what is required of all of us. That is what Patsy would expect. Patsy made history in 1964 when she became the first woman of color elected to Congress, and today she makes history again as one of just a handful of women to be immortalized in our currency. When the American Women's Quarter program was established to create or celebrate, I should say, the contributions of revolutionary women in American history, I led a letter to the Treasury Department to feature Patsy Mink, Edith Kanakaole, and Mary Kawena Pukui, all from Hawaii, on the quarter. And last year, Edith Kanakaole was featured. This year, Patsy Mink is being featured, and next year, Mary Kawena Pukui will be featured on the Native American dollar. All three historic women will be highlighted in the program. We're very proud of that, coming from Hawaii. So, it's lovely to see all of you, and I know Patsy's example will continue to motivate each of us to do what we know we should be doing to prevent discrimination of all sorts in our country. Mahalo.
Good morning. I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and I'm chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAC. I'm so thrilled to join you for this incredible event honoring the legacy of the late Congresswoman Patsy Takemoto Mink and commemorating the release of the 2024 Patsy Mink Quarter. I want to express my sincere thanks to Senator Mazie Hirono, the United States Mint, the National Women's History Museum, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum for hosting this wonderful celebration, and I'm truly honored to join you all today. Congresswoman Mink made history as the first Asian American woman and the first woman of color ever elected to Congress. She paved the way for so many of us, including myself, to follow in her footsteps. You know, growing up, I never thought I would be in elected office, let alone a member of Congress, because I saw few people like me. And that's why it's so significant that 2 years ago, Speaker Pelosi unveiled a portrait of Congresswoman Mink to hang in the Capitol across from another tireless fighter, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. And as I was speaking at that event, I was realizing just how deep the impact and the importance of the installation of this portrait was. So many young girls will walk through the halls of the U.S. Capitol, and they will look up and they will see this shining example of what Asian American women and women of color can do as trailblazers in Congress. And now, with this new quarter circulating across the country, countless Americans will be able to see or learn or be reminded of Congresswoman Mink and her inspiring achievements in their everyday transactions. And of course, we know that Congresswoman Mink had a direct legislative impact on the lives of every woman as a mother of Title IX. This banned discrimination in all federally funded educational and athletic activities and programs. And by doing that, she paved the way for greater gender and racial representation, and of course, continuously fought hard for gender equality. The bill was even renamed the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act upon her passing. Well, Congresswoman Mink was one of KPAC's co-founders and a former KPAC chair, so I am very, very honored to follow in her footsteps as I continue to serve in that same role today. So thank you again to our KPAC executive members, Senator Mazie Hirono, the United States Mint, the National Women's History Museum, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum for hosting this celebration and for all your efforts in educating the American public about the work and legacy of Congresswoman Mink. I'm so thrilled that she's being honored with this quarter, and I look forward to partnering with everyone here to ensure that Congresswoman Patsy Mink's legacy lives on. Thank you.
Aloha. I'm Congressman Ed Case. I represent Hawaii's 1st Congressional District. Wendy, so great to see you again. My colleagues in Congress, so great to see you again, and all of you. It's really an incredible moment for us to be here. I was first elected to Congress in 2002, and I had the incredible responsibility, a very humbling responsibility of taking over in a special election after Patsy's unfortunate passing. And got to know her. Of course, we all knew her at the time in Hawaii. She was a legend already in Hawaii and throughout much of the country. But to actually walk in her shoes after her passing and representing her in that seat, I became far more familiar with the true impact that she had had inside of Congress and out. In fact, the seat that I inherited was not the 2nd Congressional, it was the Patsy Mink seat. And those that disagreed with what I was doing always reminded me that it was Patsy Mink's seat. And so in many ways, she was looking over my shoulders throughout that period of my time in Congress. And still does, by the way, because I have the privilege of occupying the same office today. And so she actually does talk to me on occasion about what the right thing to do is, and I feel her aura all around. You know, it's an incredible legacy, and I often reflect on the legacy of Patsy Mink. Because if you go back to 2002, we in Hawaii knew that we had a special person and that we had lost a special person. And throughout much of the country, her legacy was already known. Generations that were already being inspired to consider that they could come to Congress, generations of athletes and others who are already being inspired to believe that they could have equality and opportunity in education and beyond. But if you take a look at the last 20 years, we see that that legacy has expanded far beyond the boundaries even of what existed at the time, and that she has become truly a part of the legacy of our country overall. And I think that's one of the points that I want to make here today, because although we admire her and remember her today as the first woman this, the first Asian American this, the first president, you know, there's a lot of firsts in this incredible life that was lived. And we do remember them, and we should remember them for the pioneering spirit that it entails. But I appreciate Mazie saying what she did, which was that this is not just a legacy and a remembrance of Patsy Mink as a woman, as an Asian American, as a minority. It is not just about the March Madness and the wonder of the UH women's water polo team succeeding this year. It really is something that belongs to all of us. And I think what this quarter really represents is a legacy of true leadership in this country, a legacy of passion, of courage, of compassion, of perseverance. We've used that word so much, and I think what we are really honoring today is something that each and all of us, whatever our condition in this country is, whether we grew up with privilege or not, whether we grew up with discrimination or not, whether we're men or women, whatever our ethnicity is, that we can all be inspired and we can all look to this life as a life of true leadership and honor it in so many ways. And this koan today, I hope, is one of those ways where people will pick it up and be inspired to learn about this incredible life, regardless of their circumstances. Thank you.
Aloha, everyone. This is very much a chicken skin moment for many of us in this room. That's a good thing, by the way, if you're not familiar with the term. You know, like all of you here, I could talk for hours about how Patsy broke barriers, opened doors, and changed lives. But in the brief time that I have with you, I'd like to instead thank her daughter, Gwendolyn Wendy Mink. You know, I'd been asked to run for Congress many times over the years, a dream I have honestly had since I was a little girl. But each time, I'd look down at my 2 young sons that needed their mom, and I'd say no. And then one day, I was asked to read a children's book about Patsy's life at my son's elementary school. And when it got to the part when Patsy had to choose between being at the bedside of her injured daughter or saving Title IX, and she did not hesitate to do what any mother would do and rush to her child's side, something in me clicked at that moment when I was reading the story. At that moment, I realized, through Wendy and Patsy's example, that I didn't have to choose between being a good mom, being there for our sons, and serving my community and my constituents. I could do both. In fact, these tough choices, the constant balancing act, the perennial guilt that often comes with being a mom that I'm feeling right now as I realize I can't go home this weekend, that's not a liability like I'd always been raised to feel it was. That, in fact, was my superpower. It's a superpower that ultimately was wielded by one of Congress's original supermoms, the mother of Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District, Patsy Takemoto Mink. And while I did not have a chance to know her as intimately as many of you have, I think if she were here, she'd agree with me that moms are inspired by and do what we do because of our children. So our daughters, like Wendy, our sons, like my Matt and Aiden, they remind us every day why we fight, why we wake up and make the tough decisions and seek to build a better world because we see it through their eyes and we have hopes for their future. Our children, in many ways, give us permission to do what we do, and they too, I know, make serious sacrifices so that we may serve. So Wendy, thank you for inspiring your mother, for sharing her with all of us. Her amazing work would not have been possible without both of your sacrifice and your service. Mahalo.
We're now going to show the documentary film Mink. It was executive produced by Naomi Osaka and Oscar-winning director Ben Proudfoot. So, you guys ready? Okay.
And now let's all play What's My Line?
Now to meet our first challenger. Will you enter and sign in, please?
Patsy T.
Mink, right?
That's my mother. First woman of color to be elected to Congress.
Do you have a title other than Mrs.?
Yes?
Do you spend a lot of time in this country, in the United States?
Yes?
Her most significant accomplishment is Title IX, which forever transformed athletics in America. And it almost didn't happen because of me. It was sort of a chartreusey mustard color, if I recall correctly. A Ford Pinto. We got in the car to go see Woody Allen's movie, Love and Death. I think it was a Wednesday. The future of equality in some large way was on the table that day when the personal and the political collided. Are you ready to go there? The story has a great ending in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, but begins in the Hawaiian Islands at the turn of the 20th century. By the time my great-grandparents arrived, Hawaii was a territory, so it was part of the United States. His name was Gojiro, born in Japan. Recruited to work for a sugarcane company on the island of Oahu, essentially indentured. Couldn't stand the working conditions, so he jumped his contract. He was the first of a long family tradition of taking a stand against injustice the only way he knew how. As my great-grandparents, you don't know what your children might produce in the next generation, or the generation after that. December 6th, 1927. They named her Patsy Matsu Takemoto. My mother. School teachers would say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" She would say, "I want to be a doctor." She was laughed at. That's not something girls aspired to or did. She was thinking, I want to be able to do what the doctor does, and didn't really see any reason why there should be obstacles in her path. My mother was an American citizen by birth, being born into a U.S. territory. By the 1940s, with World War II, the open discrimination of Japanese Americans, second-class citizens who needed to be surveilled and restricted, that was really, really upsetting for her. We ended up at the University of Nebraska. She got there and she wanted to live in a regular dorm. She couldn't. She was told she should go to the International House and apply for a room there because she wasn't white. Something needed to be done, so begins to mobilize an anti-racism campaign, make speeches, published letters to the editor in the school newspaper. I found the College of Medicine polluted with germs of a discriminating nature. I found that the dormitories were not open for people like myself. I found that affiliation with sororities and fraternities was impossible for anyone with skin any darker than the superciliously arrogant whites. Patsy Takemoto, age 19. She didn't get into any medical school. Not one. She said in some cases was explicitly told she was denied because she was a woman. She was profoundly disappointed. She wanted to change the whole system. She thought, why don't you try law school? You are an advocate. She was one of 2 women in her law school class. That's my mother. She meets my father a couple years into law school. John Francis Mink. My father was at the University of Chicago as a graduate student in geology and geophysics. Their eyes met. They knew they were made for each other. He would blast opera. They got married in January of 1951. Patsy Takemoto Mink. And in March of 1952, she had one kid. Which was me, Wendy. After law school, nobody would hire her.
She might make you a darn good employee. What's wrong with her? She's a woman, isn't she?
She said, I'm going to have to find a different path. If a law firm had been willing to hire her in Chicago, she wouldn't have gone back to Hawaii. If I can't get hired, I'm going to run for office. There was just no stopping her. Now, at this point, Hawaii was a territory. So in 1956, she ran for the Territorial House of Representatives. She won.
Representative Patsy Takemoto Mink.
I think the time has come for the American people and for the Congress of the United States to search its conscience and to recall back to 1898 the promise they gave to the people of Hawaii upon annexation that when we were ready, we would become a state.
I don't think that the people there know enough about the problem to cast an intelligent vote or make intelligent decisions.
It's no longer a question of pleading for statehood, to my mind. It's a question of rising up in indignation. I feel that the people here are ready and want statehood.
Hawaii's voters, faced with the first opportunity to participate in the nation's government, responded with a record ballot cast by 93% of those eligible.
When statehood was declared, this was her chance to go to Washington. She decided to run for Congress. It had been a nasty race, an expected reaction of people who were used to certain social norms. Politically, men had all of the power. It was entrenched. Men made them laws. A whole social system was against her. They would come up to me at rallies and, when was the last time your mother baked cookies for you? If you need to go to a party tomorrow, does your mother have time to take you to go get a dress? She was somehow an inadequate mother.
Election time in the 50th state. Democrat Daniel Inouye, Japanese-American war hero, will represent the new state in Congress to influence the course of Hawaii's development for years to come. The campaigning is in strict...
She was devastated, sitting at the breakfast table. Where do we go from here? The Democratic National Convention in 1960, my mother was asked to give one of the speeches in defense of civil rights.
And down there on the floor, addressing the convention in support of the Platform Committee recommendation on civil rights, is Mrs. Patsy Takemoto Mink.
When she started speaking, people listened.
I urge you to support the platform and to give this nation one of the greatest weapons of peace, the winning of the respect and admiration of the entire world. Thank you very much.
That was a pretty big deal, and as a woman of color, an even bigger deal. That was certainly a gift that helped her attract electoral attention. And in 1964, she ran for Congress a second time. In every election, the big contest was the primary contest. Two guys of reasonably high stature in the party were running, as was my mother. I didn't want to see my mother devastated. For me, for every election, there was this incredible anxiety, worrywart. Sometimes she also called me Pumpkin. So I was either Pumpkin or worrywart. I was worrywart that night. I was so anxious that they left me at home election night. My father, the numbers guy, kept reading the printouts of various precincts. Every time he read one, he'd call me. My grandmother, her expectations of my mother were to maintain a mighty, clean household. She didn't expect my mother to go on and get a law degree or enter politics or become the first woman of color to be elected to Congress. Yeah. We all moved to Washington.
Whenever anybody as beautiful as Mrs. Mink gets a picture in the paper, I remember.
It's wonderful to have you here. It's wonderful to have such a, as Bennett says, beautiful representative of the state of Hawaii. It's a beautiful state, and it deserves you, ma'am.
Thank you
Thanks very much for being our guest.
Immediately, she got to work.
We do have a national responsibility to speak for the women in the country. And so I have assumed that role.
No matter how excluded they have been in the past, the individual does count, and we can make an impact.
Her most significant accomplishment is Title IX, which prohibits discrimination against students on the basis of sex. It's not actually new language, it's borrowed language from the Civil Rights Act, which didn't cover gender equality in education. It's the Education Act amendments of 1972. I don't think anybody knew the full effect of those 37 words. Richard Nixon signed the bill into law shortly after the burglars broke into the Watergate. But the story wasn't over. Within months of it becoming law, they became fully aware that there were pretty big implications, specifically for athletics, which led to the enraged awakening of the male athletics lobby. Men who didn't want to share money and men who didn't want women in their sport.
Does equal opportunity mean equal funding?
You're concerned about funding women's athletic programs, is that correct?
Do you think women will ever play collegiate football?
Not at Oklahoma. We are very concerned to the point we feel that it possibly might threaten the program. The women's sports certainly will be non-revenue producing, and naturally I do not feel like total budget should be split equally.
That didn't age well. John Tower was a senator from Texas, and Robert Casey was a representative from Texas, both of whom took on the defense of male athletics. Representative Robert Casey wanted to exempt physical education from coverage under Title IX. The Casey Amendment. If Casey won, there were enormous consequences. Physical education would become the first domino. She wasn't going to let it happen. It was my mother and her allies in Congress waging the fight with legions of feminists lobbying. Casey Amendment is debated. My mother makes an impassioned speech against the Casey Amendment. It was a battle down to the wire. This was the definitive moment for athletics equity. The future of equality in some large way was on the table that day. The vote gets underway. Meanwhile, I got in the car. An oncoming car crashed into us. Phone call comes to her on the floor. Your daughter's unconscious in intensive care. I got the brunt of impact. The ultimate family versus career moment. That my mother was even in the hospital with me, given the stakes of what was happening in Washington, D.C., seems sort of insane to me. The Casey Amendment wins 212 to 211. It lost by 1 vote. My mom's vote. Yes. The windshield flew at me. All the glass fell. It cut my face. Here. Yeah, it's all along here, the side of my mouth. I'm sure the male athletics lobby were celebrating on the night of the 16th, but things were happening. Her colleagues in Congress, especially Congresswoman Abzug of New York, who was a good friend, fought in her absence. Many expressed concern for what was going to happen to me. Even a substantial number of pro-Casey people. Yeah. It was the Speaker's decision, Speaker Carl Albert of Oklahoma. He always said, Patsy and I see eye to eye, because they were both short. I mean, he was a short man. Given my mother's abrupt departure, thought about it, considered it, and decided, revote. Many on the other side came around. So in the end, 215 to 178 in favor of deleting the Casey Amendment from the Education Appropriations Bill. My mom won, girls and women won, feminists won, yes. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
Lucy with a rebound.
That is called Title IX.
It was very difficult getting into school and getting into the professions. I couldn't find a job. And when all of my contemporaries at home say, oh my goodness, what you've done to politics at home, and wish we had never heard of Patsy Mink, I'll say, well, it's because of all of your attitudes that drove me into politics. If you'd given me a job when I came home from law school, I would have been very happy.
I am the child of someone who made a huge difference for women and girls in education. She taught me change might be slow, but changes can happen. I did screw it up with the Pinto, right? For 2 days.
I smile every time I watch that film. It is now my great honor to introduce 2 remarkable women who will deliver some remarks today as well. Up first, we have Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, followed by the Director of the United States Mint, Ventris Gibson. Speaker Pelosi.
very emotional to see that film. Wendy, darling, it is a joy to see so many of you here to continue to pay tribute to Patsy Mink for so many reasons. As I know that the distinguished Senator Hirono mentioned earlier that over 18 million people watched women's basketball. Thank you, Patsy Mink, NCAA. I'm honored to be here with all of you, of course, with Wendy, and also with the members of the Hawaiian delegation. With the Mint, thank you for this beautiful coin. Now, I do want to pay tribute to Barbara Lee from California, who was instrumental in passing legislation enabling these coins to happen to honor our women leaders. You have seen so much said about Patsy in Title IX. You know that fight still continued over the years. You know that, Senator, that we still have to fight it until recently. I think the women's basketball has put that to rest now, I hope. But let me just talk about Patsy a little bit. What an honor it was to serve with her in the Congress of the United States. Here was a woman as brilliant as they come. One of the first women at the University of Chicago Law School, first woman of color. There were only 2 women in the class, but only woman of color. First woman of color to serve in the Congress of the United States. Highly respected by her colleagues when she was here early on with the Title IX. To have that revote, it was not an easy thing. To get the vote in the first place was not an easy thing. But Patsy, you couldn't say no to her. I know that firsthand. I'll go into it in a moment. I know that we're eager to pour the coins, but let me just tell you a couple things, because if you didn't know her, you should know this. It was impossible, as I said, to say no to Patsy Mink. She would stand up on the floor of the House, take apart the other side's argument, slash, 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 with a total beautiful smile on her face and a gentle voice, but getting her way. It was just the way it was. It was a joy to behold her when she took to the floor to make her case. One time she called me and she said, I think that they're going to have a candidate to run against me in the primary. I need you to be in Honolulu this night at this time. And I said, well, Patsy, you know, I love you. You have to come back and all the rest, but that Saturday I have my town hall meetings, and that Sunday I have my town hall meetings. Well, what time are they? I told her the time, and that she said, well, that's interesting. So you could be on the afternoon flight to Hawaii. You get off the plane, you come to my event, I'll put you on right away. Then you go to the airport and you get the red eye and go back home. and you'll be back in time for your 10 o'clock meeting the next day in San Francisco. I said, wow, I don't know, because I'll be coming from Washington on Friday night for the Saturday. But what can you do? You're going to go. You might as well face that reality. And that was the way it was. She ruled. She ruled. She was so respectful of everyone on all sides of the aisle, but confident in her values and the rest. Some of you know, but maybe all of you don't, how transformative, how difficult it was. There were hardly any women in the Congress. And here she was, the first woman of color in the Congress, passing this legislation, which was very resisted. You see the Casey Amendment and the rest, very resisted. And really, up until when I became Speaker, they were still trying to undo Title IX. So there's so many things that she did that were, somebody said to me the other day, how come we don't have child care in our country? I said, well, we did. We did. During the Nixon administration, we had the legislation introduced by Patsy Mink, passed and sent to the president's desk. Everybody thought he was going to pass it. But there were those in the country saying that we were giving our children over to government to babysit, Soviet style and the rest of that. It was a cultural thing. Pat Buchanan, and the president vetoed the bill. But Patsy, all those years ago, knew the value of childcare, making all the difference in our country, in our families, for the women, for the children. So she taught us so much about how, that was long before I was in Congress, but then she came back to the Congress, and we all benefited from her as a leader, as a mentor. But the smile was the thing. She could just be tearing your argument to shreds with the most beautiful smile on her face that you almost didn't realize it until it was too late. Until it was too late. So yes, she should be on the coin. She could be proclaimed, all that. And we're so proud that we put her in our congressional first. She's down there looking eye to eye with Shirley Chisholm, who was then another woman of color coming, but not until Patsy Mink set the pace and was here. So it was an honor to be with you, Senator, because I know you know how beautifully she was respected in Hawaii. And to the Mint, thank you for doing this. But I had the privilege of going over quickly and coming back again. When she left us, I felt very honored to speak on behalf of the House of Representatives at the Congress at her service. But to see the outpouring of support, the love for Patsy Mink, the love for Patsy Mink. Thank you all for making this possible. Thank you.
Aloha, and thank you so much to our speaker. She has many official titles. Mine is Speaker Forever Pelosi. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the congressional delegation and all that you've done to ensure that women are in quarters. And I was with the speaker when we unveiled the first in, I guess it was 2021, or 2022, I should say, for Maya Angelou. Why is this important? This is important because for the first time in our nation's history, we now have a Secretary of Treasury, a woman, a Treasurer, a woman. We have the now just recently appointed for Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which handles our banknotes or dollar bills as we know it as, a woman. And we have, of course, myself as a woman. And I also want to introduce you to another woman who is the Deputy Director of the United States Mint. Would you say hello, Christy? So they've turned the money over to us, and of course, we'll do it right. And we started with putting the women on the quarters. And I am so touched by what Congresswoman Patsy Mink meant to all of us. And what, for me, having worked in the Department of Veterans Affairs when Title IX was introduced, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Resolution Management, responsible for Title IX for the entire veterans of this country. And what a wonderful program. And that's when I learned about the history of the legislation, but more important, how important that legislation was for us as women. Since the United States Mint was formed in 1792, the women and men of our workforce take great pride in making sure that not only do we have circulating coin and numismatic coins, but that we bring such endearing arts, numismatic art to life as we've done with our engravers and our artists for Patsy. One of the things that I am continuously impressed by is the passion that they have for this job. Throughout the pandemic, the United States Mint, the largest in the world, worked. and we delivered coins in unprecedented numbers, 14 billion a year. And now we have an opportunity to not only celebrate Patsy and the so many other women that will be coming forth, but we have an opportunity to say to our young girls, you make a difference. You're part of who this great nation is. Yes, as we've said, women's history is American history. And to have my granddaughter and my daughter look at a quarter and see a woman is phenomenal, because these are trailblazers. These are pioneer women who have gone above and beyond to ensure that we can sit here today in many different walks of life, in many different occupations that were denied to us in the past. What a celebration for her as the first Congresswoman of color, the first. And it shouldn't stop, it should grow. What is the percentage of women in the United States? Aren't we pressing like 52%? Yeah, we gotta take over more. And I am excited also to share that the women that we have captured in collaboration with our advisory committees, the Commission on Fine Arts, the various museums that are featured here in women's history projects and various offices. And for us to come together to do this was easy, because we have something to celebrate. We have something to say, this is who she is. And when you talk about her smile, when you look at her picture, that's an infectious, contagious smile. And yes, we do know people that can smile and you walk away going, what happened? How did I end up like this? So while she was born and raised in Hawaii as a third-generation Japanese American, Patsy Mink experienced racism, as we saw in the clip. Though she experienced these challenges, she never gave up, she persevered. And courageously, she pursued leadership opportunities. And I love when she said in the clip, if you had given me a job, I would not have run for Congress. We also released a coin relatively a few weeks ago for Harriet Tubman, another trailblazer. And she too experienced many horrors that I'm sure some of us have had in our lifetimes too. For me, it was being one of the first African-American air traffic controllers in the United States Navy way back when. I won't date myself, but there you go. But when I think about from there to here, a young girl born in Roseland, Virginia, outside of Charlottesville, career goal, air traffic controller, ended up in human resources, now the United States Mint. Sometimes our dreams change and we have to embrace them. For her, the denial of that job paved a way that benefited so many. And isn't that phenomenal? Can you do just a round of applause for that accomplishment? Yes. So we are hopeful at the United States Mint, through our workforce that just loves doing this, that you will embrace the quarters, you will watch, you will share, you will educate, you will inform, you will motivate, you will inspire, you too will persevere. And just like Patsy Mink did, keep going, don't give up. Sometimes what's right in front of you may not be that path you need to take. You might have to deviate and come back stronger, wiser, willing. And in Harriet Tubman's world, she used to say, get up and go. So we need to get up and remember that Patsy's sacrifice have benefited each of us, not only individually and collectively, but benefited us as a nation, because Title IX still stands. We still need that legislation on child care, though. So that would be great. Wendy, might I ask if you would join me here for a moment? This is a presentation of the shadow box, which contains the coin and what the legislation was, and presented to you on behalf of the United States Mint. and the many people who contributed to ensuring this would happen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I am going to invite the senator and the speaker and Wendy back up so we can do the coin pour. And as you leave today after the conclusion of the program, we have a gift of the coin boards with Patsy's quarter inside.
I would like to draw your attention to the QR code on the screen where you can learn about our panelists for the panel we're about to have. But before we begin this, I would like to invite Yao Fen Yu, the acting director of the Asian Pacific American Center with the Smithsonian Institution, up. Yao Fen.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Yao Fen Yu, and I'm the acting director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, or APAC. And it is my distinct pleasure to be here today as a representative of the Smithsonian Institution. The Asian Pacific American Center plays a vital role in ensuring the comprehensive representation and inclusion of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the Smithsonian's collections, research, exhibitions, and programs. Through our education initiatives, publications, and public programs, we provide new avenues to document, celebrate, and share the rich and diverse art, history, and culture of AA and NHPIs. In addition to the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, I am also here on behalf of the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. Members of the Smithsonian Women's History Museum team collaborated with the U.S. Mint to select honorees for the American Women Quarters program in advance of their new founding director, Elizabeth Babcock, who is joining the museum in June. We are so excited for her to start. The Smithsonian American Women's History Museum aims to expand the story of America by highlighting the untold stories and achievements of women, enriching our understanding of the past, and inspiring future generations. Patsy Takemoto Mink's story is integral to the American narrative, and the Smithsonian is proud to partner with the U.S. Mint and the National Women's History Museum to commemorate her life and legacy. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific Women's Center and the American Women's History Museum are equally dedicated to amplifying stories like Congresswoman Mink's and showcasing how Asian American women are central to our nation's fabric. And speaking of inspiring Asian American women and trailblazers, it is my great honor to introduce a dear friend and staunch ally of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Honorable Erika Moritsugu, who will moderate our panel discussion today. Erika was appointed by President Biden in April 2021 to serve as White House Deputy Assistant to the President and the first ever AA and NHPI Senior Liaison. At the White House, where she's the highest-ranking Japanese American in the Biden-Harris administration, Erika supports a wide array of the president's priorities. Drawing on a successful career in the private and public sector, she engages with AA and NHPI communities and leaders on important issues such as advancing safety, justice, inclusion, and opportunity for Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities through a wide whole-of-government approach to racial justice. I cannot think of a better moderator for today's panel in reflecting on the legacy and life of Congresswoman Mink. Like Mink, Erika was raised in Hawaii. Like Mink, she was trained as a lawyer. And like Mink, she has been deeply committed to fighting for equality and inclusion in all aspects of society, whether as Vice President of the National Partnership for Women and Families, or as the Assistant Secretary for Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations at the Department for Housing and Urban Development under the leadership of Secretary Julian Castro in the Obama administration, or as General Counsel to Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Erika to the podium.
Aloha, y'all. Thank you, Yao-Fen, and thank you to Wendy for your generosity and your leadership and your courage and your grit, but it's the generosity of you sharing your story and your moms and your families on behalf of America and all of Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Also want to give a little shout out to Sharon, who's been working, as we say in Hawaii, working her okole off behind the scenes for making all of this so extraordinary and special. I'm honored to join so many incredible leaders and former Mink staff. I see all of y'all. You can't see this on the camera, but you should see this crowd filled with Patsy T. Mink alumna. And I'm so proud to be here with y'all to recognize the accomplishments that the late beloved Chairwoman Patsy Mink achieved to, amongst many, many other things, achieve gender equality in our country. Chairwoman Mink's trailblazing efforts shepherded the rise of girls and women's athletics, the movement of women into professions like law and medicine, and the increasing numbers of women speaking out against sexual harassment. Upon the unveiling of her portrait last year, President Joe Biden did muse and reflect and marveled at the fact that 37 words in an amendment to a gigantic bill could have such an impact, and we're not done yet. As someone who grew up in Hawaii with the chairwoman as my role model, it was her run for city council that was the first campaign that I ever volunteered on when I was 10 years old. And this is a proud day to honor her leadership and legacy. I did sign waving for her on the street, and I cleaned up the plates after buffet fundraisers. But her legacy and her inspiration to the work that we have, what brought us here and what we have ahead of us, is a continuing spark for all of us. Just to underscore how special this event is, I have to mention that I was a casual coin collector and was the vice president of the Junior Numismatic Society of Hawaii. So I just suffice to say that this is a true honor to honor the supermom who is making history, Wendy, again. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists, where we can learn both from a personal and professional and academic and historical perspective a little bit more about the supermom. I'd like to first recognize Dr. Felicia Kornbluh. Dr. Kornbluh is the professor of history and of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and affiliated faculty member in Jewish studies at the University of Vermont. Dr. Kornbluh worked in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. House Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families under the chairmanship of Representative George Miller of California and at the Institute for Policy Studies. They write for the scholarly and popular press and serve as the vice president of Planned Parenthood of Vermont Action Fund and a member of the board of Planned Parenthood of the Vermont IE Political Action Committee. So, ladies and gentlemen and gentlefolk, Dr. Kornbluh, please join us up here. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Elizabeth, I'm sorry, Ms. Elizabeth, I was getting ahead of your PhD, I'm so sorry. She's working on her PhD. Elizabeth A. Navarra, who is a historian and American Women's History Specialist for the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, which is the home of the Patsy T. Mink papers. Ms. Navarra co-curated the library's Shall Not Be Denied, Women Fights for the Vote exhibition during the 2020 centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Previously, she was the curator of the historical manuscripts for the University of Maryland College Park Libraries, holds an MLS in Archives Management, an MA in History, a graduate certificate in Women's Studies, and as I mentioned accidentally before, is pursuing her PhD in American History at the University of Maryland College Park. So ladies and gentlemen and gentlefolk, Elizabeth A. Navarra. Last but not least, Dr. Judy Wu is the Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and a member of the National Women's History Museum's Scholars Advisory Council, which is also very scholarly, I'm sure. She's also an Associate Dean in the School of Humanities and Director of the Humanities Center and the Center for Liberation, Anti-Racism and Belonging. She's the co-author of Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, the first woman of color in Congress, which received the 2023 Mary Nicholas Prize for the most original book in U.S. women's gender history from the Organization of American Historians. So, ladies and gentlemen and gentlefolk, Dr. Wu. So here we turn to this part of the program with these extraordinary women and leaders who are at the top of their fields, which not by accident and maybe by fate, are the areas in which we are reverence of and building upon the power and policy that Patsy Takemoto Mink embodied. So let's get started. Now it works. Wow. First question is for Professor Wu. Let's talk a little bit about the origin stories of what influenced Mrs. Mink and what brought her to the extraordinary work that we honor today. How did Mrs. Mink's early experiences as a Japanese American growing up in Hawaii during the 1930s and 1940s shape her politics and priorities? And what values and lessons did she bring from her Maui origins to her public service?
Thank you so much for moderating and for the introduction, and thank you, Wendy, for everything. This would not have been possible without over a decade's worth of collaboration. The last time I was here in Washington, D.C. to celebrate Patsy Mink, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi had invited Billie Jean King to both speak at Women's History Month and also for the dedication of the Mink portrait. And she said something that really deeply touched me. Billie Jean King said that you don't understand inclusion unless you've experienced exclusion. And Hawaii, for much of its history, especially after the United States usurped the Native Kingdom and placed it under a territorial relationship, was a profoundly unequal place, a place of exclusion. It was marked by the plantation economy, where it was very clear who were the have-nots and who were the haves. It was a place that was divided by class and by race. And that was also experienced in the educational system. So Patsy was fortunate enough to go to an English standard school, but that school system was also the way in which linguistic and racial segregation was experienced by plantation children who commonly spoke Pidgin or Creole as opposed to so-called standard English, whereas the Haole or the white students were automatically accepted. These were exclusions that were not just along class and race, but along gender lines. Patsy, when she came back and tried to pass the bar exam, was questioned as to whether she lost her residency because she married someone who was not from Hawaii. She was encouraged to work behind the scenes in political campaigns, but not to run herself. And these experiences and understandings of exclusion led her to want to advocate for an inclusive society. And here I just want to highlight that she grew up in the midst of the Great Depression and was deeply influenced by Franklin Roosevelt. She would listen to his fireside chats. And her vision of what the government could be, how the government can really make an important intervention in people's lives, I think was very much shaped by his ideas. This was her first political campaign in Hawaii, and this is what she wrote. I believe that the rights of the individual are the highest trust and responsibility of government, and that government exists for the people, to provide for the well-being of all, to raise the level of life above that of mere existence, to assure and achieve the fullest possible employment, and to increase the opportunities for a better life for ourselves and for our children. So I just want to underscore that her experiences of exclusion led Patsy to advocate for a vision for an inclusive society.
Thank you. That's extraordinary. Every time I scratch beneath the surface, I learn more and more about why she did what she did and how hard it was, and what she overcame. It's almost in spite of it, right? In terms of her grit and her courage. So we spoke about her origin story to service. I'm wondering, Ms. Navarro, if we could talk about the origin story of the movement and the contributions that she made to the women's movement. Because Mrs. Mink, as many have mentioned, including Speaker Emeritus Pelosi, was the first woman of color and the first Asian American elected to the Congress. Do the Patsy T. Mink papers at the Library of Congress offer insights into what it was like to be the first ever of many first evers and how she navigated breaking boundaries?
So thank you. I think, is this on? Okay, great. Thank you, Wendy, and the other organizers for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm so excited to be here and represent the Library of Congress and the Manuscript Division, which is the home of the Patsy Mink papers. The collection is a rich research collection. It's quite a large collection, over 880,000 items in 2,700 containers. And it highlights important events in Patsy Mink's life, but it's also just such a rich source of documentation for history in the mid to late 20th century, political, cultural, and social history for researchers. But to answer the question, yes, the papers offer many insights into what it was like to be the first, for Patsy Mink to be the first woman of color in Congress, the first Asian American woman in Congress. She had to be the first in so many other things that she had accomplished, even before getting to Congress. She was the first woman to serve as student body president at Maui High School. And after she had completed law school, as we've heard, she became the first Japanese American woman admitted to the Hawaii bar in 1953. She was also the first Japanese American woman to serve in the Hawaii Territorial House of Representatives in 1956. And then 2 years later, she went on to be the first woman in the Hawaii Territorial Senate. So lots of firsts before coming to Congress. And all of these firsts are documented in various ways in the collection, including and probably most vibrantly through photographs, which you saw some of those in the documentary. Often Mink was the only woman in a large group of men, or the only Asian American, or the only person of color within those groups, in those group photographs. Her political campaign materials in the collection as well are a rich resource to show how she organized grassroots support and how she succeeded in winning elected office, and often as the first woman to do so, the first Asian American to do so. But they also document, more importantly, how she sometimes failed, and these instances are important as well because she's kept persevering through her hardships to make broader points. I think one example of that is her bid for the presidency in 1972. She was doing, she made that bid, I think, more to make a point that women could run for elected office, and she wanted to disrupt sexist views that only men could hold such a high political office. Scrapbooks and newspaper clippings in the collection also demonstrate how she was first in many ways. Political cartoons show her breaking gender barriers, including her famous protest for women's equal access to the Congressional Members Gym in 1967. There are great photographs, correspondence documenting that. And that was when Mink, along with two other congresswomen, challenged the unequal access policies to the members-only gym, and members meant male members of Congress. And they went to an exercise class to which all members had been invited. And finally, just to mention Mink's correspondence and speech files, and they document how Mink, in her own words, fought for legislation to help others in breaking barriers. And of course, we all know about Title IX in 1972 and the Women's Educational Equity Act in 1974. And because Mink well understood the difficulties of being the first in breaking barriers, she maintained, a lifelong commitment to fighting for civil rights and gender equality.
Thank you. You are the steward and caretaker, the caregiver of some precious treasures that most of us don't have access to, didn't even know existed, but we learn from every day. I don't know if it's in your collection, that handwritten note, and talk about Congresswoman Takuta said chicken skin, the Be Back Pronto handwritten note when she was called off of the floor during that first vote. Thank you so much for your leadership and your care. Professor Kornbluh, we've talked a lot, we've heard a lot about what she's accomplished. I'm wondering if you could share some insights about how she accomplished that. So how did Mrs. Mink approach policymaking and coalition building in order to contribute to her work as a legislator and an advocate? So for example, how did her leadership for welfare justice in the 1990s manifest her approach to legislative advocacy?
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership, but thank you to everyone who's here. So I had the good fortune to write a book, to co-author a book with Gwendolyn Mink, who's an esteemed political scientist, about the welfare reform law of 1996. And if some of you worked for Representative Mink, you remember this, but I think a lot of people don't remember that was a policy, which in some ways had been proposed by Bill Clinton on the campaign trail, but sort of vaguely, and then when Congress was taken over by Republicans in 1994, when the Republicans took both houses of Congress for the first time in decades, under Newt Gingrich's leadership in the House, there was a much more aggressive and conservative version of that bill that came forward. And what emerged after that was a real debate within the Democratic Party about the legacy of the New Deal period, which Professor Wu was just referencing, and the legacy of the 1960s era, which was the era when Representative Mink first came to Congress and had a role in passing some of the original Great Society legislation, like Medicare, things that we still care about so much today. And Representative Mink played an extraordinary role in, at least in my view, bringing the Democratic Party back to its own fundamentals, and reminding the Democratic Party what it stood for, what it had stood for in the Roosevelt era, what it had stood for, at least on the domestic side, during the Lyndon Johnson era in the 60s, and what she believed and what many believed the party should continue to stand for. And it was a very profound debate. And it was a debate, speaking to her as an organizer and how she got the work done, it was a debate that occurred within the Democratic Party, within the Democratic caucus in the House, and among Democratic legislators, but it also was a debate that happened between elected representatives and advocacy groups on the outside, and even academics on the outside, like Wendy Mink and like me and like many other feminist academics who wanted to be a part of this conversation, because we've been doing work on the history of women and children, the history of the Democratic Party. So Mink just played an extraordinary role working with her daughter and with many others in the leading advocacy organizations in creating a coalition so that even as President Clinton felt a huge amount of pressure, to sort of tack to the right wing and do what they used to call triangulation, to be sort of a more conservative Democrat and a slightly less conservative version of Republicanism, right? So Clinton felt all of that pressure, and what Representative Mink was doing inside and outside at the same time was pulling the party back and applying some pressure on the other side, and particularly from the perspectives of low-income women and women of color. And she helped to build a coalition, a very meaningful, robust coalition here and on the outside, which was, it wasn't just a protest coalition, right? They weren't just saying no, they also were offering an alternative vision, right, of what a pro-woman, pro-family, pro-child-raising policy might look like. And, in the short term, they lost. They lost the legislative fight, but they also sustained a vision of what their party had been, what it was, what it could be in the future, right? And they built these very strong and very significant alliances so that they could come and fight again another day. So that's one thing that I really think that we should remember her for. There are times when you win, there are times when you don't win, as people have been saying. And there are times when, when you stand up for principle and sustain a vision of a better world. And that's what she was all about.
Thank you. Again, this was not just what she accomplished, but how. And, talking about the genealogy of legacy, many of us, and one of the reasons why I can note all of the Patsy T. Mink alumni here is because I was a direct beneficiary of her genealogy, working for Senator Danielle Keakaka, who had taken aboard many Patsy T. Mink alumni with the spirit of aloha and learning how to lead with aloha, which to me, if you don't mind me substituting a little bit of a nomenclature substitution, is what we're talking about in terms of allyship and seeing connections and working in coalition and keep on fighting. And her leadership with aloha is, I think, the example that you're setting here in terms of the example that you and Dr. Mink have written about with respect to welfare reform and its success, and also the way we move forward going from here. I think that one of the things that is an example of this story, this example, is the scope and the breadth of her impacts and the body of her work. We're obviously here sitting next to Title IX and Title IX, and one of the most prominent things that she's remembered for is her fight and courage and her battle for women's rights and her accomplishments. But I'm wondering, Ms. Navarra, whether the Patsy Mink papers also shed light on Mrs. Mink's roles in advancing environmental conservation and protection during her time in Congress, and how it might resonate with the contemporary environmental movements, speaking about legacy and genealogy of movement.
So as I mentioned before, the Patsy Mink papers document many mid to late 20th century political issues and other topics, and they're a rich research source. And one issue that's particularly well documented is environmental protection and activism. And files in the collection demonstrate how Mink engaged at local, state, national, and international levels in her pursuit of environmental protection. She was adamantly against continued nuclear testing in the Pacific, and argued that testing affected not just the United States, especially Hawaii, Alaska, and California, but all countries along the Pacific Rim, and even the world through connections of wind and ocean currents. Nationally, she took on controversial legislation against strip mining when she served as chair of the subcommittee on mines and mining beginning in 1973. And she supported bills such as the passage of the Environmental Protection Act, Environmental Education Act of 1970, and in the 1990s, she voted against attempts to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska to oil drilling. So she also dedicated considerable staff time and her own resources to state and local constituent concerns in Hawaii, including preservation of endangered lands, species, and cultural resources in the state. And her membership, when she was on the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, also enabled her to play a key role in establishing national historic sites and parks in Hawaii to preserve sacred and unique environments in the state. She also took on so many other environmental issues. I can't list them all here, but just some examples. Cleaning up military littering on and around Maui that had been caused by World War II, cleaning up radioactive waste in Pearl Harbor, stopping the destruction of wildlife and sacred indigenous island sites from military bombing, and preventing the introduction of invasive species to Hawaii, just to name a few examples. And these are all documented in the collection through correspondence, drafts of legislation, speeches, publications, other documentation that are just invaluable sources for studying environmental conservation and activism during this time period. And they also show that, speaking to connections to current environmental movements, they also show that Mink valued indigenous viewpoints and fought for saving geographic locations that seemed so far away from decision makers and leaders here in Washington. She understood the importance of scientific evidence in decision making about environmental policies. She advocated the use of clean energy, sun and wind power especially, and she believed in the interconnection of all living and non-living things on the planet. So she definitely made significant contributions to environmental protection as well.
So I thought I had the best job in the world, but your job is pretty cool. To learn and study these things and to share that wisdom out. And I think that this example about her environmental activism, underscores the generosity of Ms. Mink's wisdom and her impacts, which was not just limited to women and girls or people of Hawaii or mollusks and sea and cells, but it actually took on an international dimension. So Professor Wu, I'm wondering if you could describe Ms. Mink's international activism and her efforts, again, still current today, to promote peace and human rights on a global scale.
Thank you so much for that question. And I wanted to share three aspects or three responses to that particular question about Mink's international engagement. First, she was an early and consistent advocate for peace. She questioned U.S. involvement and military escalation in Vietnam. She arrived in 1965 just as ground troops were being introduced. And that questioning of U.S. military involvement included challenging the leader of her own political party, Lyndon Johnson. So she had the highest agreement with him in terms of domestic policies, in terms of his war on poverty. But she was among a small but growing group of congressional representatives and senators who were questioning whether the United States was in fact promoting democracy in Vietnam, or whether the United States was modeling inhumane forms of warfare that exacerbated racist understandings and perceptions, especially of Asian people. It was a war that was fought primarily through the measurement of body counts. Right? So that was one hallmark of her international activism. Second, to build on Liz's response about environmental justice, I thought Mink's understanding of environmentalism was really in line with her understanding about human rights. She served as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, International Environmental, and Scientific Affairs under President Carter. And she articulated the connection between environmentalism and human rights, particularly women's rights. These are quotes from her speeches. "We know that at least 1 billion people still live in poverty or near poverty. Of the poor, women and children suffer the most. Of the world's illiterate, 3/4 are women. And so what she wanted in terms of environmental program was to understand how the human condition so that all people can share the bounty of the earth to enjoy good nutrition, safe water, and a healthful environment in which to live. So in her mind, it wasn't necessarily to protect the environment from people, but to think about how to live in balance with the environment and to have a sustainable environment so that human beings and non-human beings can thrive. And then the final thing I wanted to share with you is to go back to the first question of how did Hawaii shape Patsy Mink's vision of the world? Her concerns about militarism, her concerns about environmentalism are deeply connected to what I consider a Pacific worldview. Growing up in Hawaii, Mink developed an appreciation of the natural environment, and she also witnessed the economic and military impact of the Cold War and the tourism industry, both on her islands and also on other islands in the Pacific. She protested against nuclear testing by US and European powers in the Marshall Islands and the Bering Strait. She condemned using Hawaii as a testing site for chemical weapons and as a training site for pilots testing bombing raids. She reminded us of the value of the environment because of her upbringing in Hawaii. And this is a quote from her. "Those who have lived in an island environment where the interaction of the element is perhaps more readily apparent than elsewhere have a greater awareness of interdependence." There's a tendency to think about Hawaii as being small and far away, especially if you're on the continent of the United States and especially if you're based in some place like Washington, D.C. But I believe Mink's politics, her vision of peace and environmental justice, reminds us of the islands of the Pacific. And the Pacific is actually the largest body of ocean water around the world. It constitutes a third of the world's surface. That the islands and waters are in fact deeply connected to the broader world.
Thank you. Professor Kornbluh, this question is for you, but I think everybody actually might want to have a say here. So let's round robin it if the other panelists are willing. But I think that we could close with some reflections on how Ms. Mink's legacy lives on and what lessons we should draw from her life and times.
Yeah, I hope everyone does weigh in on that. So for me, and this is something that actually Professor Wu and Professor Mink emphasize in their book, that she had a philosophical principle that was about not just tearing down, but building up, right, and providing an alternative vision. And that's certainly something that that we saw in the case of her resistance to conservative welfare reform and her resistance to some of the things that even Democrats were contemplating doing. And Wendy Mink and I worked with a coalition around the country called the Women's Committee of 100, which was a group of women academics and writers. And Representative Mink was our sort of woman on the inside. And our contact here, and to some degree our organizer, and what she was developing and what we were trying to kind of support her with was having a vision of what politics and policy would look like if we really cared about women and children and families. And that was not the policy that we had at the time. It's not the policy we have today. Where we're still under supporting especially low-income parents and their kids, and exposing them to all kinds of vulnerability that's not necessary. So that's what I take away. I think Title IX, we see it in women's sports, and it's been utterly transformational there, but the vision of Title IX is a vision for dramatic social change, right? It's about having equality across the board in every matter of higher education, right? Not just on the ball field or on the basketball court, right? But what if we were really paying attention in to find out whether women are experiencing diminishment when they try and get into the engineering school or the physics program, you know, and if we were really taking care of and making sure that people weren't experiencing sexual harassment and violence as they attempt to complete their educations, right? So I think what I take away is, you know, this is somebody who was a practical politician, who knew that she had to get elected, who knew that she had to, you know, get the legislation over the line in order to succeed in this environment. But it was part of a much bigger vision of creating a better world, and always with her eye on the prize of people who are vulnerable, low-income people, women, and especially women of color. That's what I'd really take away.
If anybody can follow that, it's Liz and Judy. So, Liz.
I guess I would just echo all of that. That she was and is a role model for women and girls, and that she fought, she stood up for and fought adversity and discriminations, and stood up for change, and believed that there was a better world that was possible through working through the political system and through legislation. And I think this is all documented in her collection, and even though Wendy and Judy have literally written the book on Patsy Mink, I still think there are many other research interests in the collection to be discovered by future scholars.
I definitely want to support that because it was just not possible to cover everything that she did in her career. I love the phrase "ahead of the majority," and that's actually the title that Kimberly Basford's documentary about Patsy Mink. That's the title of her documentary. But it also is a phrase that Patsy Mink used when she was running for the Senate unsuccessfully in 1975, 1976. And I love what that phrase encapsulates, right? To be ahead of the majority, to not wait until something is politically safe to support the cause or the issue, but to stake a principle, a claim, and say that this is important for us as a society to support, and that we are going to advocate for it based on principle, we are going to support it with resources, we're going to show leadership. And I think that model of advocacy, of ethical forms of change-making is what we need in our society.
Well, thank you to an amazing panel assembled here about an amazing woman. Today's been a grand celebration of Chairwoman Mink. We've talked a lot about her ceiling-cracking career and her leadership in Aloha and all of her political and policy accomplishments. Thank you to everyone who was able to come out and celebrate this extraordinary woman's achievement. And again, she's made history again. So mahalo nui.
Well, thank you, everyone. This concludes our program today. I encourage you to look at, you'll grab a Patsy Mink quarter, but also to explore the other women in this program. There's 19 other remarkable women, and I hope that we can continue to amplify their voices and contributions to our nation. And one quick plug, if you want to buy them, you can go on the Mint's website. They are running low on all of their coins for this program. They've been so successful, so I do encourage you to go buy some rolls of this coin and the others. Thank you so much for joining us.